So now we've talked about how equilibrium is determined in this model. So AE equals Y, so desired aggregate expenditure equals actual national income or actual GDP. We solved this graphically here on this screen, and we also solved it algebraically on our OneNote. And so now we're going to talk about what happens when something changes in our model. So what happens when either the intercept changes of our AE function, what happens to, it goes up or down, what happens to our equilibrium national income, and what happens when we change the slope of this function. So what happens when we change something in Z? So if you remember last time, we introduced this idea of the simple multiplier. So let's make sure we differentiate. So this should probably say simple multiplier. Let's make that a little bit more clear. Simple multiplier. That's just a differentiate between the simple multiplier and the multiplier, which we'll talk about next chapter or the chapter after. And so if we remember, we solved this model, so we got y equals a over 1 minus z. And we want to talk about when something changed in capital A, what change in y do we get as a result? And so we kind of took the changes on both sides. The change in y equals the change in A over 1 minus z. And then we called this simple multiplier, so SM for short for me, is 1 over 1 minus z. So this SM is like the change in y over the change in A. So what that's telling you is that an increase in $1 in capital A is going to increase y by 1 over 1 minus z. And so remember, z is between 0 and 1. And so it's 1 over some decimal point, so it's greater than 1. And so what happens when we add government and foreign trade to this model is that this z gets smaller. So the AE curve gets flatter, and this simple multiplier is going to get smaller. So before, the simple multiplier was just equal to the marginal propensity to consume. So before, it was just equal to this B, or this marginal propensity to consume. Now we're multiplying it by 1 minus T, which is less than 1. And we're also subtracting the marginal propensity to import, or M. So this is getting smaller, which means our Z is getting smaller, which means our simple multiplier is getting smaller. Which means now every time we increase autonomous aggregate expenditure by $1, our equilibrium actual national income is going up by a smaller amount than it used to. So that's how the simple multiplier is being changed. So let's think of a couple different ways where we're going to have some changes in equilibrium. So the first new thing that could change is something in this net export function. So if something, let's say, exports, so if something in foreign incomes went up, all of a sudden our exports would go up, and then that export function would shift up and would increase y. On the other hand, if foreign incomes went down, our exports shift down, which is going to decrease our equilibrium actual y. So again, exports are autonomous with respect to domestic GDP. So the level of X, that constant X for exports, doesn't rely on Y, but it depends on foreign income, which I just mentioned, but it also depends on domestic and foreign prices, exchange rates, which are similar to domestic and foreign prices, as well as taste. So for some reason taste shifted, so we really enjoyed more goods from a particular country, then our imports from that country would go up, which means their exports would go up, for instance. So fiscal policy is policy enacted by the government. And so we can think of the two roles of the government in this model being government purchases as well as taxes. And fiscal policy is going to be the government kind of changing either of those things, either the tax rate, little t, or they're changing government purchases, capital G. And usually fiscal policy is designed to stabilize Y, or national income, around its potential. So if you remember, we talked about this idea of business cycles. And so we'll just quickly draw. So let's say this is time, and this is real GDP. And we talked about this idea of potential income being represented by Y star. So this would be Y star. And the business cycle are kind of these ups and downs around this potential. So this is like the actual Y that we see in our economy. So maybe right now we're kind of on a big downturn right now. And so what fiscal policy is trying to do is try to kind of limit the peaks and troughs of this business cycle and try to make it so our actual GDP is around the potential. So maybe this is how it would look like without fiscal policy. And what fiscal policy is trying to do is, if we kind of draw the same idea with this Y star, they're really trying to smooth these business cycles out. So instead of having these big peaks and troughs like we see up here, we can see these kind of smaller peaks and troughs. So the economy doesn't have these big ups and downs. It kind of just slowly grows over time, which we would probably much prefer. Let's just finish the axes there. So that's the idea of fiscal policy, is to kind of limit the ups and downs of the economy. So the point of the last line here on this slide is just that, it's fairly intuitive, but we usually know which way we should be adjusting things, in the sense that if we're in a recession, we should either be increasing government purchases or perhaps decreasing the tax rate to kind of stimulate the economy or kind of push actual GDP up. But it's not clear by how much. I mean, we see this debated right now in terms of our response to the COVID crisis, where there's a lot of debate about how big these packages should be. There's no debate in the sense of like that there should be some kind of increase in government purchases or some kind of money going into the economy. But it's about how much. That's the debate, and kind of how to do it, I guess, is really the debate right now. So let's take a look at the two kinds of fiscal policy we could see in this model. All right, so the first is some change in capital G. So that's some change in government purchases or expenditures. So let's take a screenshot of this. And so here we're having this change in G, and so G is going down here. So if you remember, G is in capital A. So it's one of those members of autonomous aggregate expenditure. And so A is getting smaller. So I'm just going to say A goes from A to A prime, where the difference here is that decrease in capital G. And so if we look at our graph, we see that equilibrium Y is going down because this new AE curve is crossing at a lower point. And so we have this change in G on this y-axis and this change in Y on the x-axis. So we know it's going down, but by how much? Well, we can use our simple multiplier here. So we know that the change in Y equals the change in A over 1 minus Z. Here that change in capital A, for example, is 100 million. So this is going down by 100 million. 1 minus 0.25, since that's what we're given as the Z. And if we did this math, and I mean it's right below, we see this change in Y is minus 130 million. So that's what this change in Y is on the graph. So instead of having to resolve this model where we kind of plug in this new government purchases and it's $100 million less, we can just see what changed in the equilibrium without having to resolve the whole thing by just using this simple multiplier and multiplying this simple multiplier by some change in capital A. So that's how changes in government purchases are working in this model, or this first kind of fiscal policy. So let's look at the second kind of fiscal policy, and that's them change the tax rate. And so if you remember, the tax rate came into, let's take a screenshot of this, If you remember the tax rate, where that came into was Z. If you remember, Z was B, or the marginal propensity to consume, times 1 minus T minus M now. And so what we're doing here is changing this T. So what that's going to do, so for instance, let's say we lower the tax rate. So T is going down. So that's what this first one is doing. And so what's going to happen is there's nothing in capital A is changing, but the slope of this AE function is changing. So we used to have just Z, and now we have, let's say, Z prime, where this has changed. The steeper slope is a result of T going down. So notice that that's going to change our equilibrium here as well. So if we lower the tax rate, that's one way of kind of using fiscal policy to stimulate the economy. Now, if we wanted to slow the economy down, we could raise the tax rate, and that's going to make this AE curve flatter, which means it's going to intercept or going to cross this 45-degree line at a lower point. So that's a way of slowing down the economy. So those are the two different kinds of fiscal policy that we could see. The final thing we need to talk about for this chapter is this idea of demand-determined output. So I'm just going to actually skip ahead a couple slides. We already solved this on the OneNote. I just wanted them to have them somewhere on the slides. But we did that algebra, and we did this example as well. This was the exact example we did earlier. But I really want to underline this point about this model that we've been working with so far, is that it's entirely demand-determined, in the sense that we're assuming that producers are willing to supply more of the product without demanding a higher price. We probably know that that's not true in a lot of cases. Though strangely enough, maybe it's true right now. So we really want to start to loosen this assumption going forward. So, this slide is basically talking about whether this is a reasonable assumption or not. Right now, this might be a reasonable assumption because we're in this COVID crisis and output is probably below its potential, and quite a bit maybe in the coming months. And so firms are going to be able to increase their output without increasing their costs. So maybe this is actually not a bad assumption for right now. Though usually we think about firms wanting to raise their prices to supply more, and that's why we have upward sloping supply curves, right? And so in this next chapter, this is the assumption we're going to start to relax, this idea of constant prices. So we're going to think about what happens when we start to change the price level in our economy.